So while I've done my share of research into your background, for the sake of the oral history, could you provide like a quick walkthrough of your career thus far?
Sure. So my name is Ken Field. I am a saxophone player, a composer, flute player. I started playing when I was 10. Started playing clarinet and been playing music ever since. Switched over to the flute and the saxophone in college, roughly. I spent a good part of my life doing computer work. I was a scientist at Bolt, Beranek and Newman, place that invented the internet, and did speech recognition, speech bitrate compression, real-time systems for quite a while I was playing music, and then I switched over and became a full-time musician back probably 25 years ago. So I've been doing music full-time for a while. My current focus is on New Orleans second line music. I have a band called the Revolutionary Snake Ensemble that plays widely, tours, and records. Also have played with some experimental groups, a group called Bird Songs of the Mesozoic, which was quite active in the 80s and 90s. I played with a guy named Willie Alexander, who a kind of post-punk guy who joined the Velvet Underground briefly. So I've done some other interesting things. I've had a lot of great opportunities to play music, write music. I've done some soundtrack music for Sesame Street for my late wife, Karen Aqua. And currently I'm doing all those things, but also I'm a member of the Second Line Social Aid and Pleasure Society Brass Band, which is a community-based brass band located in Somerville, Cambridge, Boston. It's the band that was the initiating force behind the Honk Festival.
Fantastic. How long have you been a part of the Second Line Social Aid and Pleasure Society Brass Band?
I joined the Second Line Brass Band after 13 years ago. The very first year of the Honk Festival, which was 2006, my band Revolutionary Snake Ensemble was invited to play. I quickly realized, A, that the Honk Festival was awesome, and actually it was a surprise to me because the organization was a little chaotic, and I was not coming from more of a commercial side of things. I was expecting a little more clarity. But in the end, it was clear to me that it was beautifully chaotic and not problematically chaotic, and that added something to the event, and that a couple of things, that it was an event that I wanted to help make happen. I wasn't involved in the organization the first year. It was an event that was geared towards activist street bands. The Revolutionary Snake Ensemble was not that, was a commercial professional band. So I realized that was not a band that moving forward was so appropriate for that festival. And I realized that I was motivated to apply my whatever musical ability I had to playing music for activist and political, social activist activities. And so I joined the Second Line Brass Band at that point. So 2007, roughly, I think.
That's fantastic.
Short answer.
How have you kind of seen your experience with Honk change as both, organizer and a performer?
Over the years, how has it changed over the years? Well, I don't think it's changed. I don't think my perspective has changed a lot. I think I saw it, the festival and the band, as an opportunity, as I said, to do some good things in the community, which I think is an important thing for people to do, to be active in my community, active. And I would say that's continued. What I've learned from both of those organizations, they're separate organizations, the band and the festival organizing committee, is that they're both non-hierarchical, meaning there's no leader and everyone is equal. And I've learned that that's a very difficult organizational structure to maintain. But it's also a very powerful organizational structure. And the frustration that goes with decision-making in those kinds of organizations is, in my opinion, balanced by the ability to have multiple brains kind of parallel processing, and eventually you come up with a decision that I think is almost always the right decision. If you have one person who's a decider, it's their decision. So this way you have a lot of people kind of, shuffling, the decision shuffles around, and eventually it filters out the bottom or the top, I'm not sure, with a good decision.
Beautiful. So kind of speaking about the decision-making process,
yeah.
what do you think the big sort of decisions / the milestones have been in the progression of the Honk Festival over the last 10 years?
Well, there have been so many, and being that we're non-hierarchical, we talk about every little thing. So there even are little decisions, but some of the bigger decisions have to do with the direction of the festival, the maintaining the non-commercial aspect of the festival. How do you raise money for an organization where you're not accepting sponsorship, or you're not accepting banners with the names of a bank? And how firm do you stick to that principle? How do you decide which bands are going to attend the festival when we have a history of bands, maybe some bands that came in at the very beginning who are part of our family, quote unquote, who maybe are not so activist? Do you continue to call yourself a festival of activist street bands when there are outliers? And we talk about all of those things. We talk about what is an activist street band. What does that mean? Does that mean that they're out at rallies every week? Does it mean that they're all community-based and they're all inclusive from all kinds of dimensions of inclusivity? Does it mean that they play in the streets? Some people, that's their definition of activism, is to take public space and make it available to the public. Make it, again, available to the public as opposed to commercial enterprises. How do you deal with commercial enterprises? I mean, they're part of the community too, so there's nothing evil about people making a living. So and all of these very vague and very important issues get discussed within our committee, and we come up with answers. How do we promote the festival? How do we interact with the infrastructure within the community, with the police? Some people have issues with engaging with the police because they've had experiences, or they know people have had experiences that are not so positive. We have a very positive relationship with all aspects of our community, the government, the police, and so we discuss all of these things, and some of them are not so much decisions, but they're directional guidance that we come up with, and we decide what to do. You
spoke a little bit about engagement with the police and the relationship that the Honk Festival and a lot of the performers have with the police.
Mm-hmm.
And it's my understanding that this previous iteration of Honk, you guys or a bunch of people went and they actually performed outside of an ICE detention facility.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
This is one of the programs that have been added, or one
Yes.
part that has been added to Honk.
Mm-hmm.
What other sort of adaptations, other iterations / programs have been added to the Honk Festival?
Right. So we started out as a festival that was primarily a gathering of activist street bands. And we didn't, as a festival, early on, specifically target particular issues or events that we as a festival wanted to address, or inequities that we as a festival wanted to address. We left it to the bands, each of whom had their own agenda, their own concept of the world and what needed to change and what they were focusing on, and we left it to the bands to speak for themselves. More recently, we have chosen to take on some issues as a festival. So a few years ago, we targeted wage inequity and minimum wage activism as a festival, and we encouraged bands to participate in events that would focus on that. This past year, we focused on a kind of broad three-part topic of home, of housing inequity, of environmental issues which affect our shared home, the planet home, and the issue of immigration, which is, of course, an issue related to home. And so we shined a little bit of a spotlight on those issues. And the presence at the ICE detention center in in part of Boston is something that came about a few years ago and was instigated by one of the bands and has become a very important part of the festival. And that, I think that we view that as a means to, we have viewed that over the years as a way to show our support. Maybe support isn't the right word, but a way to show the detainees that they're not forgotten, and to just be there, And a lot of times when you're trying to support anybody or anything, being there is the most important part of it, or is a very important part of it. So that's the goal, I think, of that particular action, is to be present. And we talk about what is activism, and part of activism is being present, being really present, not just there in body, but there in mind. And so one thing that's happened, and it happened this year just before our festival, is that the ICE detainees were moved out of that facility. A few months before it was announced that they were going to be moved out in December, but they were moved out just before our festival. And so the event then was not so much for ICE detainees, but for other detainees at the facility.
There you go. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And now that Honk has gotten a lot of worldwide acclaim as well. Yeah. Different bands from all over applying to come join the festival. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure people from Brazil have different sort of needs and things that they're advocating for in comparison to people, very local.
Yeah.
How do you guys go about selecting the different issues that you want represented at the festival?
It's there's a subcommittee within our organizing committee that takes on that role of partnering with community organizations and determining what issues, in collaboration with those community organizations, are things we want to focus on in a particular year. Again, we don't speak for the individual bands, and of course individual bands are made of individual people, and each of them have their own perspective as well as any individual group of individuals would. So the bands speak for themselves and express their own issues and say what they need to say while they play. The issues that are very important to, as you mentioned, Brazilian bands and the country. There are now 5 Honk festivals in Brazil, and I think part of the reason is the political situation there has become very, from our perspective, very dismal. And I think the power of the bands to impact the political situation, we don't want to overstate our impact on the world, but I think that people recognize that this kind of activism and having music contribute to that kind of activism is helpful in affecting change. And I think the presence of 5 Honk festivals and many, many bands in Brazil is a testament to that.
Perfect. There's a lot there that I want to touch on, but I'll touch on it a little bit later. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that there's 5 Honk festivals, in Brazil now.
Yeah.
It's my understanding that there's, Honk festivals that have now spread across, the world.
Yeah.
And you've been affiliated with one that is based out of Australia, right?
That's right.
How have you seen that festival in comparison to the one that you've
right.
constantly been in Boston, Somerville?
Right.
What sort of comparisons do you
right.
draw for both of those?
Right. So each of the Honk festivals is independent. They call themselves a Honk festival. Sometimes they contact us and say, we want to start a honk festival. What do we need to do, or what are the guidelines? And we say, well, here's what we do. Here's what we think you might want to do, but they do whatever they want. We have no control over the other honk festivals. Some of the festivals are more or less focused on activism. Some of them, because of the community they're based in, call themselves festivals of community-based bands rather than activist street bands, because it just is less tenable for them within their own community to call themselves activists, I think is the bottom line. One thing that we're doing, and I'll get to a direct answer to your question in a second, but one thing that we're doing that I've been pushing for is to set up a set of shared principles so that all of these honk festivals can understand, and the rest of the world can understand, what is it that characterizes a honk festival. So even though we have our differences, what are the similarities? What are the things we share? And that's an ongoing process. And as more festivals get added, it becomes more complicated because everybody, again, as with each band, as with each individual, each honk festival has their own perspective on the world and on their community. The festival in Australia, it's located in the city of Wollongong, which is about an hour and a half south of Sydney on the east coast of Australia and New South Wales. It started out more as a community festival. The bands were not always mobile as we try to make them in Boston. They were not always activist, similar to the way the situation was in Boston in Somerville when we first started. We're sort of finding our legs. And I've seen a clear and very gratifying movement in Wollongong in the Honk Oz Festival, motion towards activism, towards realizing that the bands and the festival can help to create social and political change. And the situation in Australia, there's a lot of concern about the government there. So there's a lot of about the immigration situation in Australia, the detention centers there's some parallels with what happens here. And so I think that the festivals, first of all, the political situation in the world has kind of pushed people towards activism. I also think that the presence of our emphasis on activism in the originating Honk Festival has kind of nudged people in that direction. And there are a number of very activist street bands in Australia that are, right in there as part of this festival. So I do see a movement. It's not a clear and discrete movement. It's a continuous change, but it's very clear to me that there is change.
Phenomenal.
Yeah.
Out of curiosity, obviously activism is going to be something that is a core tenet of all of the Honk festivals, but what other sort of principles have you started to think about that you'd like to see in all of the Honk festivals?
Well, yeah, that's a really good question, and you're getting to what our shared principles are. One shared principle is that the bands that are invited are non-commercial, largely non-commercial. That that they're community-based, that they're inclusive, that they're diverse on, as many dimensions of diversity as you can come up with. That the festival, we encourage the festival to be free to the public. That's not possible for all the festivals. So, that may be a principle that goes out the window when we sort of agree on something between all the festivals. I think, I don't have that list of shared principles in front of me, but those are some of the important points. I think the principle that one of the principles that we've tried to be true to is the idea that audience and band are not separated by distance, by stage, by um, and that audience members can think of themselves as potentially joining a band, for example, or being, I don't know, being on the same level as the band, being more equal than typically in an arena concert. And that's not always possible, but that's another goal and something that we think is an important thing to think about.
Fantastic. When I was at the Honk Festival, I definitely felt a lot of those tenets, like really created to the culture. And the culture aspect of Honk is something that I'm very interested in. Obviously, all those tenets, contribute to them. But when you start to think about the culture of a Honk Festival, of particularly the Somerville Honk Festival, how would you describe it to somebody who has not been a part of the festival before?
The culture.
Yes.
I think the overriding element to the culture of the Honk Festival is one of non-commercialism, of inclusivity, of community base, and of activism, however you define that. And as I said, many people have different definitions of activism. My personal definition of activism is, as I might have said, that each individual can play an active role in affecting the change in the world that they think is important, or the changes that they think are important, rather than watching what happens. They get involved and help make things happen. We're not the first to talk about that, but we think that's important. And so encouraging people to get involved, and sometimes that's getting involved in the festival. We have a lot of volunteers, and they're involved in the festival. We have a lot of people who help house the bands that visit us from all over the world, 500 musicians. And the housing is all supplied by people who voluntarily open their homes. That has a very significant impact on how people view themselves in terms of the festival. That brings them together with the bands, with the musicians, makes them feel like they're part of the event, part of the family, and as does the volunteering, as does the support, the financial support we get from individuals and businesses and government, the community as a whole. And then the kind of worldwide, I don't know, movement is a little presumptuous, but the worldwide honk community is a community. People have their Facebook pages, and people talk to each other about different issues that they run into, about music, about community, about activism, and it's a community. It's really quite amazing.
Fantastic. Something that I always thought once I found out about it, like the fact that you guys house all of the bands who come, I thought it was very special.
Yeah.
Very atypical, I think, from a lot of other festivals.
Yeah.
But definitely understands or contributes to the fact that it is a big community event.
And by the way, that housing, that is a difference between our Somerville Festival and the festival in Wollongong in Australia. And we've talked about that. I've talked to the organizers, obviously, about that and how I feel like that's been a significant way for the community to feel part of the festival in Somerville. But it just appears that that's not so feasible because of the culture there. I don't know, because of the layout, because there are various issues that enter into all these kinds of things, and it just doesn't work out as well for them there. So,
that makes sense.
C'est la vie.
Something that I've always been interested in as well. Has the culture that is now commonplace throughout the Somerville Festival specifically, has it always been that way? Or you mentioned that the first iteration, your band wasn't necessarily so activist.
Right.
Have you seen that with the inclusion of more activist bands and the programs that have started to pop up, the culture has significantly changed, or has it been kind of just like a general progression?
I think a general progression. I think some of the bands that continue to be part of the festival that I would say they're similar to my band that is not an activist band. They're maybe a little more commercial. But what I've seen is that those bands, in many cases, have, seen the light in a way, and decided on their own to participate in activities that I would consider to be meaningful and community based. I think any considerate and thoughtful musician does things for their community all the time, but I think and my band does, but that's not our main focus. And so I see other bands that are shifting their focus a little bit towards that those kinds of activities.
That's phenomenal. Would you say that a lot of the bands shift their focus largely around the Honk Festival, or is it in even their own?
I think in general. Of course, everybody's different. Every band is different. Some do, some don't. We typically bring a band up every year from New Orleans, partly for musical reasons and tribute reasons, because a lot of the music that we all play is originated in New Orleans. So the brass bands in New Orleans are sort of our what we look to for musical guidance. And a lot of those bands, their situation is very different from ours, and they can't come up to a festival like ours. They can't even play music without being compensated, because they're commercial bands, in other words. And yet we find that it's important for them to be present at our festival, for a representative band to be present at our festival. There are a couple of other examples like that. And so there's a little bit of a difference, but what we do notice is that those bands have their own areas of activism, and that their participation in the Honk Festival over the years, certain bands have come back many times, and they have become part of the community, even though there's some differences in where they're at. But they've become part of the community. They've been involved in actions and events that are very clearly political or socially active events, and not that they wouldn't have otherwise. I mean, I'm not saying that we've done this, but I do notice a progression on the part of many bands, and I think it's what our goal is, really. From my perspective, our goal as a festival is to encourage people to be involved. That's simple.
Phenomenal. So you spoke about how a specific band or bands, genre of bands, may have a lot of influence over kind of what the festival becomes and in general. Do you have like a specific band that you kind of remember over the course of time that really did have a very impactful impact on the festival itself?
Well, there are many bands. There's the Second Line Band, started the festival, so members of it started the festival. That significant impact. It's a different, maybe answering a different question from what you're asking, but there's certainly there's a band called Rude Mechanical Orchestra based in New York that's just very in your face, aggressively. I hate to keep using the word activist, but that's the best word. And I think they have brought to the festival a passion and an impact of what they do and what maybe they think other bands might want to do. That's had a significant impact on the festival. That's different from the musical impact that, say, other bands have had that are amazing musicians. The Hungry March Band in New York, the March 4th band, a couple of the Providence bands are just incredible musicians. Some of the New Orleans bands that have come up, just amazing musicians that have had an impact on that side of it, on the musicianship and the repertoire, adding repertoire. So there's a number of different dimensions. One thing I haven't mentioned that I should is that the reason I've gone to Australia, in general, I've been invited to lead a pickup band over the past 5 years of the festival. And that's really a very clear and concrete way for people to get involved in the festival, to play music, to learn how to play maybe a little bit. And these are pickup bands that welcome any level of musicianship, maybe starting with some basic ability, but up to advanced professional players. It's been very successful in Australia. We've had as many as 100 people playing with me for this pickup band over the years. It's grown from a smaller band to now people just are participating at large numbers. And so this year we started that in Somerville, and we had a pickup band here. We have had pickup bands here in the past, but it kind of faded out. So we've reinstituted that. I co-led that, and we had really great participation. And the reason I mention that is there are many dimensions of being active and participating, and musically, participating musically is one of them. So that's something we're doing.
That's beautiful. In regards to sort of like these big bands, these big pickup bands, my understanding is that the Somerville Honk Festival has taken a lot of care to keep the numbers controlled in terms of performers and numbers of bands. How do you sort of balance getting so many people involved, advocating for a lot of different causes, and continuing to keep sort of like the continuity, keeping the culture, the family, as you described, within the festival?
It's a very good question, and it's a balance it's just a balance question. We have more bands that want to participate than we can accommodate, and what we can accommodate is dictated by several things: the physical layout of the areas where the festival takes place, also the capacity of the volunteer organizing committee. And so we have made a decision that we really need to limit things to maybe 25 bands. We've had 30 in the past. It was overwhelming. Now these bands, we look at all kinds of aspects of the bands when we decide what bands we're going to invite in a particular year from the pool of bands that have applied to attend. And one of those aspects is how many people are in the band. Do we have the capacity to support this band? We generally, we also look at their level of activism. Are they a commercial band? Are they a community band? How diverse is the band? How welcoming? How good are they? Are they good players? And we weigh all of those things. And also, are they bands that have attended the festival a lot in the past? And that's both a positive and a negative, because we're building this community. We don't want to cause bands that are part of the community to not be part of this particular festival. But at the same time, we want to make room for new bands that are coming up that have spun off from old bands or just formed inspired by what's happening or maybe totally on their own, inspired by the political situation in the U.S. or elsewhere. So we try to add new bands every year, and we try to allow the bands that have been coming year after year to attend. Sometimes we ask a band to take a year off, maybe because there are 30 people, and we could have two 15-piece bands come that are new, and the bands generally understand those issues that we're working with and that we have to consider.
Very thoughtful. That helps a lot color a lot of the things that I was thinking about. You spoke about diversity a little bit. How important is selecting bands with diversity, creating sort of a diverse population within your performers to the organizer?
Right. It's very important. It's one of our, I would say, one of our top considerations. And, we speak about diversity often. By we, I mean people in the world speak about diversity often without really defining the term. And so we've tried through many conversations within the committee to be clear about what we're talking about. Are we talking about age diversity? Are we talking about gender diversity? Are we talking about sexual preference diversity? We're talking about racial diversity. We're talking about cultural diversity. talking about musical style diversity. There are many dimensions to the word diversity, and we as a committee are not as diverse in many of those dimensions as we would like. We would like to welcome onto the organizing committee members who would add to our diversity as a committee, because I think the diversity of the organizing committee assists, in diversifying the festival. No matter how well-intentioned people are, if they're not themselves of a variety of whatever, all those things I mentioned, it's harder for them to be cognizant of what that means in terms of bands, in terms of what are their actions. So that's one element of it, is diversifying the organizing committee to the best of our ability, inviting people in who can help us do that. In terms of how we look at bands, as I said, there are many elements we look at, and diversity is among the top element. In the world of music, gender diversity is a very big issue, because the world of music is dominated by men, and it's not. It's desirable to encourage bands that are all women, are gender diverse, and of course the festival as a whole, in terms of racial diversity, is mostly white, and we're quite aware of that, and we do what we can to invite bands that are more racially diverse, to invite bands that are non-white and that are from other cultures. And many of those efforts end up being more complicated than we would have thought, in terms of economic issues, in terms of cultural issues, and the fact that we're a festival that doesn't pay a fee in general to the bands, where we consider ourselves a conference of these bands, but yet they perform for the public. There are some people across all elements of diversity who think that's not appropriate. I, as a professional musician, I have a little bit of a struggle with that, asking people to play for free. Basically, we compensate them for their travel, and some bands we realize there's no way they could come up without a small fee, so we do offer a fee for some bands. Most bands we do not. And so there are many things that come into play, and basically the world is messy and not simple, and we deal with that messiness and that complexity to the best of our ability.
I, for one, very appreciate all the steps that you guys have been taking towards creating a more diverse community within the Honk family.
Mm-hmm.
I guess kind of going off of all of that,
sure.
Of course, diversity is something that people continue to strive for.
Right.
But in addition, in your opinion, what sort of things would you continue to work at to continue to see the Honk Festival develop in the next 5-10 years?
I think for me, one of my principal goals is the is the unification of the Honk community, of the various Honk festivals. I see a couple of motivations for that. One, as I said, is to let allow the festivals and the public at large to understand what it means to be a Honk festival versus a brass band festival, a commercial festival that isn't quote unquote a Honk festival. But there's another benefit to having these separate Honk festivals around the world, and that's in terms of ecological issues. The environmental impact of having bands fly here from far away is significant and is something that's becoming more and more clear as the years go by. So to have the festivals focus on more local bands is something to consider. Of course, there's also a benefit to seeing people. For me to go to Australia, there's an impact of that, but there's also a benefit of me hanging out with people who were not American, basically, and bands going down to Brazil, or Brazilian bands, or whatever, bands coming from Europe and from all over the place. There's a benefit and there's a cost. So, but I think the proliferation of honk festivals can have that positive impact of keeping things a little more local, and therefore not having so much of a footprint. I think our ability to keep this thing going over 14, 15 years is pretty awesome. And to maintain a committee of volunteers that runs it, it's not run professionally. We've been able to avoid hiring people to run the festival. I think it would be a totally different festival if we ended up doing that. I think our ability to continue to have a non-hierarchical organization is, again, amazing from my perspective. It's, as again, very frustrating sometimes, and frustrates some people to the point where they leave the committee. But I think it's a source of power, actually, and a source of wisdom. And so we have decided that we're not going to grow the festival for all of those reasons. That's kind of counter to the way things in the world tend to work. And so I think our success is in our ability to remain true to ourselves, remain focused on what we want to do, and continue to do, what I hope people think is good work. It's a modest goal. It's not a goal of having more impact or bigger impact other than the additional festivals around the world. I think one thing some of us are talking about, since next year in the United States is an election year and our festival takes place shortly before the election, is how we can encourage people to vote, encourage people to take part in that process of democracy. And are we doing all we can as a festival to help that to happen? That's some of the people on the committee are very focused on that, and I hope we can have an impact that way. As a nonprofit, we're not allowed to advocate for or against a political candidate, but we can certainly encourage people to participate in the process, to vote, to register, all that, and it's critically important.
I completely agree. I think that's also very important. Advocating for these things, they're good for society, just getting people involved. Speaking of involvement, we've talked a lot about how the bands have created this culture and how the performers are able to contribute to this sort of greater vibe. But in regards to the onlookers, right, the people who were sauntering in the streets and they hear this music and they come and just get involved for a few minutes, how important or how much are you guys thinking about the people who are just coming to the concerts, to the festival? And what sort of things do you do to keep them engaged, to try to give out the messages for as long as possible?
Yeah, it's again, it's a balance. All of life is, but a lot of people, especially early on in the early years of the festival, had no idea that we were a gathering of activist street bands, and they just came because it was awesome. And that's their words, not mine. Because people felt like this was a weekend they look forward to all year. We repeatedly get that feedback that this is their favorite weekend of the year. It's like, wow, humbled, But I think more and more people are understanding that what we are, and part of that is the message we get out through media, that more and more of the media are aware of what the festival really is about, and that it's both. It's a fun time. It's an awesome, fun musical experience, and it's a gathering of activism, of activist street bands, and people are getting that. People are understanding that more and more, and they're forming their own bands. They're helping out with the festival. I don't know. We don't keep statistics or take surveys on how many people who attend the festival then get involved in their communities in various ways. No idea. But and I don't. To me, I don't know. I don't really think that's something we need to do. I think we do what we do, and we make, I don't know, nudge people in a direction, and we hope that they'll realize that the power they have. So it's interesting because every year in Australia, I bring to the pickup band. It's called the Hoot Pickup Band. Hoot is a nickname that I was given by another musician here in the Boston area. So the Hoot Pickup Band. And I bring a new arrangement or a couple of new songs, some songs that I wrote, some song arrangements of other material. Sometimes I try to arrange some Australian material. There's a song called Beds Are Burning, which was a big hit back in the 70s about giving Indigenous people their land back in Australia. I've done, a couple of different things. So this year, I've been trying to think about what new piece to bring to that pickup band, and I decided that I'm going to do an arrangement of Patti Smith's "People Have the Power," and I think that's that's the message. That's the message that Patti Smith was trying to communicate with that song through many years, and I think it's a really worthy message to communicate through the honk festivals.
I love that. Well, that's all the questions I had.
Okay.
I think that's a very powerful note to kind of leave on. I wanted to thank you so much for your time. That was so informative and very insightful. And I can't wait for everybody to be able to get a little bit of information, learn a little something from this time that we're able to spend with you.
Well, thank you very much for doing this.
Really appreciate it.
Okay.